The Kotaku, and it's an old article, back in 2013, wrote a turn-based combat is the best kind of combat article, and I just wanted to say solidarity, with Kirk Hamilton in this. The editor's note says I'm on vacation today, but since I know you're all craving your regular dose of JRPG goodness, I've enlisted the wonderful Kirk Hamilton to jazz up random encounters this week. Be nice. Oh boy, here we go. If you're going to take over a Jason column for the week, that means I'm going to talk about the Japanese role playing games. And if I'm going to talk about Japanese role playing games, that means I'm going to talk about one of their defining characteristics, turn based gameplay. Surely turn based combat is one of the defining characteristics of the JRPG genre. This is, of course, a video game genre that's notoriously difficult to encapsulate or define. I usually help Jason edit his column each week, and I always get a kick of watching him write such well articulated observations regarding a genre that's nebulous at best. What makes a JRPG a JRPG? Man, I couldn't even begin to say. Ask 10 people to define a JRPG, and they'll give you 10 slightly different answers. If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say the same 10 people would mention at least a couple of the following: something about hair, something about a group of teens saving their hometown of the world, something about a burning village, and something about turn based combat. I'm no JRPG expert. I never had a PSX or SNES growing up. I first played Final Fantasy seven in 2011 when Leo Alexander and I wrote a letter series about the game. But recently, I've come to fall in love with the genre, thanks in no part to the gentleman who normally writes this column. And all the qualities that can be said to largely define the JRPG genre, turn-based gameplay is the one that I find the most appealing. In an effort to abdicate myself of having to seem like some sort of expert on the subject, I bugged Jason on his vacation to see if he agrees that turn-based combat, while not necessarily present in every JRPG, is still a defining characteristic of the genre. Here he said, "First of all, I can't believe you're interviewing me for my own column, sneaky Kirk. But I think that it's hard to find a game with turn-based combat that isn't a JRPG. But a JRPG doesn't have to have turn-based combat. It's like, okay, let's say a JRPG is a salad, mostly because of what I'm eating right now. Turn-based combat is the lettuce. If you have a lettuce, you probably all have a salad. There are different kinds of lettuce, all with different tastes and textures. Lettuce is pretty much the defining characteristic of a salad, but you can have a damn good salad without it too. Right now, I'm eating kale and edamame, which is pretty much the secret manna of salads. The secret of manna of salads. Sweet. Okay, this has been Random Encounters, your one-stop stop for all things RPG, JRPGs. Have a great weekend. Just kidding. Okay, that's the good stuff. Let's stick with the lettuce metaphor. Of the JRPGs I've played, even the ones that didn't have this feat that didn't exactly feature strict turn-based combat, still had a turn of sorts. They were all salads, even if they didn't quite look like salads. Final Fantasy 8, so you've got, no, is that 9? And like, oh, so 13, the combat system, so that's 13. The combat system, of which Jason has mentioned being a fan of, I enjoy too, uses an active time battle system that isn't as turn based as Persona or Trails in the Sky, but it's not quite Bayonetta either. Nino Kuma's combat was never really gelled for me, but it got easier to conceptualize when I began to treat it as a sort of turn based system where the turns were defined by my cool off time. The salads still have some sort of lettuce, but I've just been prepared quite differently than they used to be, you know. But by and large, most of the JRPGs I've played, and like over the decade, have featured strict turn-based combat. They include Persona 3, Persona 4, Final Fantasy 7, Legend of Heroes, Trails in the Sky, Final Fantasy Tactics, Devil Survivor, Overclocked, and Fire Emblem Awakening. These games are all very different in a lot of ways, but they appeal to my video game brain in the same way, and they feature turn-based gameplay. I thought I'd break down why turn-based appeals to me, and I sense too many others. Here we go. It gives me time to use my brain. No fucking shit. I agree. I love the moment at the start of a JRPG battle when my party is standing still, squared off against the enemy. The battle music starts up and like everything pauses. It's a deep breath before the storm. I size up my enemy. I like to imagine he or she is sizing me up too. In Fire Emblem Awakening, I'm picking my party, and this amazing music is playing. In Persona 4, I'm analyzing my foe for weak spots and picking my best persona. In Final Fantasy Tactics, I'm also taking the lay of the land as my little dudes march in place. So good. Not no matter what I'm doing, no matter what strategies I'm planning or plans that I'm hatching, I have the space to do it. I'm unhurried by my enemies and unhurried by the game's design. When so many games force me to rely on muscle memory and years of practice in addition to quick decision making, JRPGs let me rely on my brain. Turn-based combat is purely cerebral in an uncommon and welcome way. It makes the toughest bosses feel manageable. I really like games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, but sometimes I have a tough time with those bosses, particularly the massive skyscraper-sized ones that require me to run up, bash a weak spot on a heel or knee pit, then strike when the moment is right. I love the spectacle, but the entire thing can be difficult to get my arms around. JRPGs certainly have a building-sized bosses, but due to their turn-based nature, it's much easier to methodically approach the fight. I find myself facing a god-sized Sephiroth or a world-ending Nyx, but I can take as long as I need each turn to get my head together and figure out what's working and what's not. As Jason and I once discussed, the best JRPG boss fights feel less like fights and more like puzzles, and I really like that. I'm not sure this makes me any better prepared to actually fight an apocalyptic life and in real life, but it certainly makes the game more enjoyable. It lets me enjoy the soundtrack. Some of the best JRPG music happens during battles, and in turn-based games, you're really able to listen and enjoy. The Persona 3 sub-boss music, the bitching Final Fantasy 7 boss music, the jazzy music in Terras in the Sky, the amazing way that Fire Emblem Awakening mixes two arrangements into one musical melody. The list goes on. With all those games, the turn-based rhythm of plays allows the music to really get into the skin. It lets me enjoy the art. Similarly, the turn-based gameplay gives me a chance to really sit back and appreciate the artist who worked on the game. JRPGs also feature some of the amazingly designed imaginative enemies. It'd be a shame to blast through the fights without ever really seeing them standing still. I love the design of every monster and boss in the Persona universe. I've never gotten a chance to take a good look at if they still didn't stand still. By the way of contrast, I'm reminded of both Kid Icarus Uprising and Bayonetta, two very fast-paced games that feature cool enemies, but enemies I rarely had much of a chance to study and appreciate. Sure, games that often unlock miniatures that you can go and check out some sub-menu or another, but I like being able to appreciate a game's art during the actual game. Turn-based combat lets me do that. It's perfect for handheld gaming. Between the 3DS XL and the Vita, so it's something of a golden age for the portable JRPG. While the 3DS library continues to fill with all kinds of varied games, and I've heard the Vita jokingly referred to as a JRPG device, that's been true in my experience, and that's a-okay. I've played many of my favorite games in the last year on one of those two systems, and I've come to realize that turn-based games and handheld consoles are a match made in heaven. For starters, the notion of wolfing down an 80 to 100 hour JRPG becomes much more doable the moment it's happening on a handheld platform. If I can play it on the couch, on the bus, or over at my sister's hours, it makes for it easier for me to fit such a large game into the cracks and crevices of my life. After recently spending 60 hours completing Ni no Kuma on my TV, I can report that I would have happily played that game on the Vita, and I wouldn't have lost a thing. Turn-based games are particularly well suited for mobile gaming. If I'm playing a video game on the go, there are all matters of distractions. I have to be aware of what stop I'm on, or which sheet I've opened up, or whatever my bag of groceries is about to tip over. I've tried to play action games like Mario Kart and Uncharted on the go, and find that in general a transit environment isn't compatible with involved action-based, video games. God, seriously. But turn-based games work flawlessly, and he says perfectly. If I need to look up and check which stop I'm on, or push over, or let someone else sit down, I can do that without even pausing the game. Though I've certainly missed my fair share of bus stops due to Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics. What's more, most mobile gaming takes place in fits and starts. 5 minutes while waiting for the bus, then pause to get on the bus, then 10 minutes on the bus, pause to get off. Turn-based gameplay itself, it places in fits and starts of a sort, and as a result is a much more compatible with actually being on the go. Lets me get the most out of combat. JRPGs are almost incredibly deep games. Their combat starts out simple and gets more complex until you're dealing with 5 or 6 sorts of magic weapons that have been crafted to feature any sorts of specialization. Half a dozen party members who each have unique abilities, and enemies that change states and are immune to an ever-shifting variety of attack, and a codex work that buffs and debuffs, changing your party's entire makeup at the drop of a hat. If these games weren't turn-based, I wouldn't be able to process half of that stuff. I find that with action games, far from relatively simple ones like God of War to the more complex Devil May Cry's and Metal Gear Risings, I tend to keep things fairly low level. I just don't have the bandwidth to deal with the constant speed of battle and increasingly elaborate moveset. I'm certainly not saying this type of a game is invalid or less than. The ability to master DMC's combat is amazing, and it's a rewarding, fun experience for those who choose and are able to do so. But for me personally, I find that when a game is turn based, I'm able to go a lot deeper into the game's dusty corners. I love talking with people about JRPG combat because for once I get to be really hardcore about it. Steven and I still have this hilariously micromanaging conversations about our party makeup and approach in Fire Emblem. Whenever I'm able to snag some more time to play Final Fantasy Tactics, the conversations I have about job points and mission strategies are mostly impenetrable, hugely nerdy, and utterly wonderful. I really like going deep into a combat system and find that turn-based systems give me the space I need to get comfortable enough to do so. I understand that this is a personal preference, but I'm generally able to wring a lot more out of turn-based games than action games, which makes them feel richer and more rewarding. Of course, turn-based gameplay is nothing new. People have been taking turns for ages, and many of the world's most popular games, from Go to chess and checkers, are turn-based. The notion of turns is one reason that football is so fun to watch, since, as Tim Rogers puts it, it's in essence a real-time turn-based hybrid strategy game. Turns are games, and turns are games DNA, and video games are simply reflecting that. JRPGs aren't the only video games that to use turns. Either XCOM Enemy Unknown was one of my favorite games of 2012 and was largely due to its turn-based design. The underrated 3D game Ghost Recon Shadow Wars is the closest thing I've got to a mobile XCOM game, unless you count Fire Emblem Awakening. And while the increasing popularity of asynchronous multiplayer games like Hero Academy, as less obviously RPGs games like World with Friends, and most obviously Super Stickman Golf too, the evidence is that turn-based gameplay isn't going anywhere. It's not going away. So I guess the birds had it right with their riff on the book of Excellently. To everything a turn, turn, turn. There's a season, turn, 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 and a boss fight for every hero in the kingdom, or something like that. I Okay, regarding Kotaku, I was never a big fan of the whole Gamergate thing. I mean, I personally like, hypothetically speaking, it could, if I were to allow for the possibility that this was really motivated by ethics and video game journalism, it's like still does not justify the campaign of harassment that went on there. And another thing that I wanted to point out was just that particular, like, okay, I never was a big fan of video game journalism. Not a big fan of it because, journalism's response to this particular industry has never really been all that, thrilled with it. And these days, if they do cover it, they cover it in a very condescending fashion. It's kind of like, fuck the Nintendo Switch. We think that system's only intended for kids. This is the kind of shit that you get out of these fuckers that call themselves video game journalists. I mean, there's a lot of it kind of feels a lot like a lot of the journalists that get consigned to the journal to that space just begrudgingly cover video games. Not They didn't want this role. They wanted to be covering more serious topics and got stuck, being the one to contribute the video game journalist column. And so there's a lot of shade and hatred that's thrown at, and misunderstanding and just inability to comprehend. For instance, the Switch is not necessarily intended only for children. They're just one demographic the system is targeted at, among many. Like, you get that kind of shit coming out from the direction of the video game industry, the video game journalism industry. So it's like, I'm not really a fan of those guys. Really, to be honest with you, I've never really been all that thrilled with the state of video game journalism. But and the fact that there are ethical problems in that space, where there's a little bit of an ancestry. But what killed me about that whole thing being used to justify the big campaign of harassment that went up against So Quinn, it struck me that particular publication, nobody gave a shit about it. It was not very popular until Iran began to basically publicize the stories of his relationship with her, And then, of course, the internet went absolutely apeshit and wild in the most, embarrassing way fucking possible, and made, gamers look like awful, terrible people who, just outright enjoy harassing women for, you know, God only knows what reason. It's just something that they found to be a fun little experience to engage in. And, to be honest with you, I also was one of the people that pointed out Anita Sarkeesian. Actually, there was this whole mythos about her that she, called herself not a gamer, and it got me. Like, I was going there, and I was seeing this, and I was seeing what people were saying, and I was like, I think that people are jumping to a huge degree of fucking, like, seriously, they are jumping to a conclusion here that is just not fair or valid, which is just, there are plenty of us that participate and play video games but wouldn't want to necessarily call ourselves gamers for whatever reason, that we would distance ourselves from that, particular label. And, for me, I guess my frustration around the concept of labeling is just, what people are saying is true. Like, there's this particular pithy saying that goes around, like, labels belong on soup cans, not people. I I think that labels are both, useful to communicate things that would describe us, characteristics that we would attach to ourselves, but at the same time, these things are not meant as something that is meant to define us in our entirety or our entire essence. And so it became readily apparent to me that, like, I might enjoy the occasional role playing game, and that may be tabletop, and it may be video game, it may be a video game. Either way, I enjoy that experience. I enjoy role playing games. That's just a reality, but I also enjoy a whole myriad of other kinds of content. And not only that, but not everything that I see gamers do would be something that I would necessarily want to associate myself with them as a block of people, particularly the way that this particular cohort tends to treat the opposite sex. Just saying.